Here we're going to cover the last part of anthropogenic changes to the nitrogen cycle on a global basis and talk a little bit about nitrogen deposition. Most terrestrial production is nitrogen limited. Yet nitrogen deposition has been increasing. So all of those increases in atmospheric N2O, NH3, and NOx really generates a large atmospheric pool, relatively large atmospheric pool of reactive nitrogen that then can come down with precipitation or through dry deposition into terrestrial ecosystems. Some of the consequences of this nitrogen deposition, when it's at a relatively low rate, can stimulate carbon storage. So if we fertilize to a certain point where productivity increases, we get an increase in carbon storage. And a lot of the land carbon sink that we discussed is associated with nitrogen deposition, increasing productivity and stimulating carbon storage. But we can also have nitrogen saturation. So it's possible to have too much nitrogen being added to the system and changes in the way that that system works. Such that if you have too much nitrogen, you can actually have declines in productivity. And there's been parts of the world where nitrogen deposition has been so high that those ecosystems have actually seen declines in productivity. So for example, with all the nitrogen that's being added, you can get loss of cations, and we talked about that in an earlier chapter, and you can also get acidification through a couple of different processes. So having too much nitrogen is not necessarily good and can lead to decreased productivity. Lastly, the consequence of having nitrogen being added is to have changes in species composition. And I'll talk about this in a supplementary video later, but we're going to see shifts in the types of species that you have there, and that can have large changes in how those ecosystems work.